Imagine standing in a public square in Burkina Faso. The sun is harsh, the crowd quiet. At the center, a young man in military uniform steps up to the microphone. He doesn't speak of war or national elections. He doesn't beg the West for aid. Instead, he looks across the sea of faces and declares, "It's time. Africa must have one government, one currency, one passport." The crowd freezes, then erupts. That man was Captain Ibrahim Traoré, interim president of Burkina Faso, and what he proposed on that stage may go down as the boldest political statement in modern African history. Not because the words where new leaders have spoken of African unity for decades, but because he made it sound urgent, real, immediate. He wasn't dreaming aloud. He was building something, now. But can Africa, home to 54 nations, thousands of languages, and deep political wounds, truly come together under one flag? Is this the dawn of a new chapter, or just another beautiful speech lost to time? And perhaps the better question for all of us, especially those of us watching from across the ocean, is this what happens to the world if Africa finally unites? This video dives deep into Traoré's three-part vision: a single African government, a common currency called Afro Money, and a continental passport that tears down borders. If you've ever felt that Africa's progress has been slowed by outdated borders and outside influences, you're not alone, and this space was created with you in mind. You're watching a channel that doesn't claim to speak for Africa. We take the time to listen. If this message resonates with you, please consider liking this video, sharing it with someone who still believes Africa needs permission to move forward, and subscribing if you believe that truth should always come before headlines. It didn't begin with a war. It didn't begin with a coup or a treaty. It began with a microphone, a flag, and a quiet moment on stage. In a packed auditorium somewhere in the heart of Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, barely in his 30s, rose before the nation. The flags of the Sahel fluttered behind him, and uniformed soldiers stood solemnly at his side. But the young president didn't speak of local politics. He didn't talk about security operations or oil prices or election cycles. Instead, he did something few African leaders have dared to do in the modern era. He looked directly into the cameras and in calm, deliberate tones called for the creation of a united African government, a political union that would erase borders, pool resources, and speak to the world with a single voice. Alongside it, he proposed a single African currency, which he called Afro Money, and a single African passport to guarantee every African the right to move, work, and live anywhere on the continent. It was not just a speech. It was a shockwave. The hall went silent just for a moment, then erupted in applause. But what happened next was even more telling across the continent. From the neighborhoods of Accra to the business districts of Nairobi, social media exploded. Hashtags like United States of Africa, Afro Money, and One Africa began trending. Videos of Traoré's address circulated in multiple languages: French, English, Swahili, Arabic, accompanied by music commentary, even tears. It felt like a spark had been lit. And yet this was not the first time an African leader had dared to dream of unity. In the 1960s, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana stood before the newly formed Organization of African Unity and urged his peers to form one continental government now. His call, while passionate, was dismissed by many at the time as too radical, too sudden. What followed was decades of hesitation, half-steps, and fragmentation. But something about Traoré's tone made his words feel different. First, because he wasn't offering a dream for the next generation. He was calling for implementation today. Sources close to his administration revealed that technical teams are already working on feasibility studies, how currencies could converge, how a Central African authority might function, and what steps could be taken in the short term to create unified policies across nations. Second, because Traoré is a leader with a reputation for action. In less than 2 years, he expelled French troops from his country, rejected IMF and World Bank financing, and established regional military and economic cooperation through the Alliance of Sahel States AS alongside Mali and Niger. These were not symbolic gestures. They were bold, risky moves that realigned Burkina Faso's place in the global order. So when Traoré says Africa must speak with one voice, people take him seriously. Not just because he's young or charismatic, but because he's already proven willing to do the unthinkable. And yet, the magnitude of what he proposed is staggering. A single African government would require the reimagining of entire political systems. Presidents and parliaments would have to surrender power to a central authority. National currencies would need to be retired. Military forces would have to operate under joint command. Immigration policies, tax codes, banking systems, all of it would have to be restructured. It is not hard to see why many African leaders were caught off guard. Some have already voiced quiet concern about losing control or being overshadowed by more dominant states. Others worry about regional conflicts, language barriers, and economic disparities. And yet, for the people, especially the youth, this moment feels different. For decades, ordinary Africans have struggled to move freely across their own continent, visa restrictions more severe than those for Europe. Trade between neighbors has been crippled by currency instability and bureaucracy. Jobs lost, families, divided dreams postponed because of borders drawn not by Africans but by colonial rulers over 100 years ago. Traore is saying enough. His message, both simple and radical, is this: Africa doesn't have to wait. Not for permission, not for approval, not for the world to take it seriously. And that, more than anything, is what makes this moment so powerful. Because once a people begin to believe that they can determine their own destiny, not tomorrow but today, then history begins to move. What began as a single speech quickly became a continental tremor. Within 24 hours of President IBRAHIM Traoré's announcement, a wave of headlines swept across African newsrooms. But it wasn't just reporters taking notice. Diplomats, policy analysts, and presidents across Africa were suddenly on alert, not because of what had been discussed in some private summit, but because no one saw this coming. There had been no prior consultation, no backroom coordination, no roadmap leaked ahead of time. It was a frontal declaration, a leader placing the idea of a united Africa not just on the table, but at the center of the room, daring everyone else to respond. For many, the shock was visceral. In capitals from Dakar to Addis Ababa, officials reportedly scrambled to understand what Traoré truly intended. Was this a symbolic speech to rally the youth, or was Burkina Faso serious about moving forward with plans for a single government, a single currency, and a single passport? Behind closed doors, some African leaders expressed deep unease. A few reportedly felt blindsided. Others, particularly those whose power is closely tied to maintaining national sovereignty, viewed the announcement as politically dangerous. One West African official speaking anonymously was quoted as saying, "Unity sounds beautiful until it threatens your throne." It wasn't just the boldness of Traoré's words, it was the timing, the urgency. This wasn't a vision for the next 50 years, it was a call to begin now. And that sense of immediacy, combined with Traoré's reputation for acting first and explaining later, shook the very foundation of how African integration had been managed slowly, cautiously, and often with heavy outside influence. In contrast, Traoré's message bypassed the traditional gatekeepers. He didn't ask the African Union to create a commission. He didn't call on Europe or the IMF for feedback. He spoke to the people directly, and the people responded. On TikTok, young Africans remixed Traoré's words with beats and music videos. On Twitter and Facebook, hashtags multiplied "Africa is one Traoré vision, Afro Money now." On the streets, discussions broke out in cafes, marketplaces, barbershops, and mosques. For decades, young Africans had grown up watching their leaders attend summits that promised unity but delivered little. But now, here was someone not only speaking their language, but moving at their pace. Traoré's message landed differently because it wasn't delivered in academic forms or diplomatic corridors. It came from a soldier president who had expelled foreign troops, rejected Western loans, and built regional military coalitions and survived. His credibility came not from perfect governance, but from political courage. He had done what others feared. And that lent weight to every word he spoke. While African social media celebrated foreign embassies fell unusually silent. But silence in geopolitics is rarely neutral. Western powers, particularly France, the United States, and the European Union, began quietly assessing what a united Africa might mean for global trade, military alliances, and financial control. Traoré had already expelled French troops, suspended French media outlets, and rejected IMF loans. His call for a continental currency and government struck at the core of Western influence, especially in regions where post-colonial ties remained deeply entrenched. In Washington, analysts on Africa briefings raised questions: would Afro Money weaken the role of the US dollar on the continent? Could a unified Africa make it harder to divide and negotiate country by country? And if Africa speaks with one voice, who will control the conversation? The concern wasn't just symbolic. A continent of one, 4 billion people, rich in resources unified under one political and economic identity, would dramatically shift the balance of power in global institutions from the UN Security Council to the World Trade Organization. In Paris, the mood was reportedly even more tense. France has long maintained deep financial and military ties across West Africa, especially through the controversial CFA franc, a currency many see as a symbol of continued colonial control. Traoré's proposal to eliminate such dependencies was seen as a direct challenge to this legacy. But not all reactions were celebratory. In some regions, skepticism lingered. Older generations who had lived through broken promises of unity in the 1960s and 70s asked, will this be another dream that fades? Others worried about who would lead this new Africa. Would powerful countries dominate the conversation? Would smaller nations be sidelined? Would rivalries be replaced with new forms of hierarchy? Still, among all these questions, one theme emerged. The conversation had shifted, and it could not be undone. For perhaps the first time in decades, the idea of African unity wasn't a quiet academic topic. It had become a living question, urgent, messy, emotional, and people everywhere were finally talking about it. Outside the grand halls where bold speeches are made, life continues for millions of Africans in quiet, often overlooked ways. Bumpy roads, unstable currencies, young people without jobs and passports that carry little weight beyond the borders of post-colonial states. That's why President IBRAHIM Traoré's vision didn't just echo through the corridors of power, it reached deep into the lives of ordinary people. If Afro Money becomes a reality, it will transform the way people buy, sell, save, and survive. Right now, a grain farmer in Burkina Faso finds it nearly impossible to trade directly with a merchant in Nigeria without paying steep currency exchange costs. A carpenter in Togo faces endless bureaucracy trying to expand his business into Ghana. Exchange rates fluctuate, paperwork piles up, profits vanish. But with Afro Money, trade would become more accessible. Inflation could be better managed within the continent. And most importantly, Africa would no longer be shackled to foreign monetary systems like the CFA franc or the US dollar. Suddenly, the idea of an economy built by and for Africans doesn't seem so distant. Then there's the matter of the passport. A student in Mali dreaming of studying medicine in Ethiopia must currently apply for visas, prove financial solvency, and often face rejection despite both countries being African. A young woman in Senegal hoping to open a hair salon in Côte d'Ivoire must register as a foreigner, pay extra fees, and deal with unfamiliar laws. A single African passport could change all of that. It would allow people to live, work, and move across the continent as freely as someone might travel between states in the US. It would reunite families divided by colonial borders and bring opportunity where bureaucracy once stood. This isn't fantasy. It's the reclaiming of something fundamental, the right to move freely in one's own homeland. Of course, such transformation has serious political implications. If a united African government were to take shape, it would mean national leaders relinquishing some control. Ministries of Defense, Finance, Immigration, and Justice would need to coordinate or even consolidate under a continental authority. For those in power, particularly in nations where authority is concentrated and protected, this is not evolution. It is a threat. Tensions may arise. Wealthier nations might hesitate to support struggling economies. Democracies may be reluctant to integrate with military-led governments. Local political elites could resist ceding influence to a supranational body. There are valid concerns about ethnic, linguistic, and cultural divisions. Africa is home to over 2,000 languages and hundreds of ethnic groups. Moving too quickly toward unity could inflame old tensions or create new ones. But if done wisely and gradually, integration could also become a tool for healing. Rather than focusing on borders, governments could redirect energy toward shared infrastructure, shared healthcare, and shared environmental stewardship. Political competition could give way to cooperative development, and national pride could coexist with continental identity. Not everyone is convinced. Older generations who've seen dreams of unity rise and fall wonder if this will be just another hopeful moment lost to time. And yet something is different now. This movement isn't being driven by political conferences or dusty policy documents. It's being driven by young people. They aren't waiting on the African Union. They aren't impressed by long speeches. They're posting digital mock-ups of Afro Money banknotes. They're designing prototype passports. They're talking about this future at university lectures, barber shops, and Sunday services. They're asking a simple, urgent question, if not now, then when? In politics, lasting change often doesn't begin with law. It begins with people thinking differently, dreaming differently, and acting differently. And right now, across the continent, that shift is already underway. In Washington, Paris, and Brussels, President IBRAHIM Traoré's speech didn't go unnoticed. It wasn't just another African leader making noise. It was a signal, a potential turning point that Western policymakers could not ignore. Because if there's one thing history has shown, it's this. Whenever Africa talks about unity, the rest of the world pays close attention. For the United States, the idea of a united Africa presents both a challenge and an opportunity. From a security standpoint, Washington has long maintained military partnerships and counterterrorism operations across the Sahel. A unified African defense structure could reshape those dynamics, reducing reliance on foreign bases and advisors. It would mean dealing with a central authority, not individual states, a profound change for U.S. foreign policy in the region. Economically, the implications are even greater. Africa holds vast natural resources, lithium, gold, rare earth metals, many critical to U.S. industries. If Afro Money is adopted and African trade becomes more internally driven, the dollar's influence may shrink, and American companies may face tougher negotiations with a bloc that acts as one rather than 54 fragmented partners. And geopolitical, a united Africa cooperating with BRICS nations or leaning toward new trade partners like China or Russia could tilt the balance of global power. For American policymakers, that possibility is quietly troubling. Behind closed doors, the question is not, what did Traore say? It's what if he's not alone. In Paris, the reaction was more emotional. France's colonial history in West Africa has left deep unresolved ties. French troops were stationed across the region. The CFA franc, still used in several countries, is linked directly to the French treasury. Traoré's decision to expel French forces and call for a new currency system not pegged to Europe's financial institutions is nothing short of revolutionary. For many in France, it signals the crumbling of a sphere of influence they once believed was unshakable. And while French officials have responded cautiously, some voices in French media now describe Traoré as a danger, a populist, or a destabilizer. But others, especially among African diaspora communities in France, see him as a liberator. This stark divide shows just how much is at stake, not just economically but symbolically. In China, India, Brazil, and other rising powers, the response has been more muted, but not indifferent. For these nations, a unified Africa may be seen as a valuable partner, a future megamarket, a strategic ally, and a voice that could reshape global institutions long dominated by the West. And in multilateral spaces like the United Nations and WTO, a united Africa would wield enormous voting power, potentially reframing everything from climate negotiations to trade rules. The world is watching closely, not just what Traoré says next, but how Africans respond. Will other leaders join him? Will the African Union take a position? Will the people push the idea forward, even if institutions hesitate? Because if that happens, if unity gains real momentum, the world order as we know it may be entering a new phase. History rarely announces itself with clarity. It often arrives quietly on a stage in a small country through the voice of a leader most of the world hasn't yet learned to pronounce. And yet, in moments like these, when bold ideas meet a restless generation, something stirs that cannot be undone. IBRAHIM Traoré's call for a united African government, a shared currency, and a single passport is not just policy, it is defiance. Defiance of division. Defiance of a world order that has for too long treated Africa as a resource to extract rather than a people to empower. But as powerful as his vision may be, it comes with warning signs. History also shows that those who challenge entrenched systems often face resistance not just from foreign powers, but from within. From those who profit from borders, from those afraid to let go of control, and from those who fear that unity might mean the end of their personal authority. And yet the question now is no longer whether Africa can unite, but whether it can afford not to. Because in a world where global powers consolidate their strength through economic unions, trade blocs, and joint security forces, Africa's fragmentation is not just inefficient, it's dangerous. So we ask you, the viewer, especially those who've seen decades of political change from your living room or through the pages of history books, do you think that President IBRAHIM Traoré's national reform strategies are truly effective, yet can we continue to trust him to carry this vision forward, or should someone else rise to succeed him? Please leave your thoughts in the comments. These are not simple questions. They deserve real, thoughtful answers. And if you believe that Africa has waited long enough, if you believe that unity, sovereignty, and dignity should not be postponed, then please share this video with someone who still believes Africa must ask permission to grow. And subscribe if you believe the truth is more important than the headlines. Thank you for being part of the conversation. And until the next one, stay informed, stay grounded, and stay hopeful.